I'm Nancy Laffey from Completely Quilted in Ponca City, Oklahoma, and today I'm going to be doing a video demonstration on foundation paper piecing. So I'm going to be demonstrating on my latest foundation paper piece project, which is behind me. It's the Santa's Hat Shop quilt, and it's compiled of one really cute block. I think you could do it as a beginner project, and it also comes in traditional piecing methods. So this is the pattern from Melissa Mortenson. You can purchase the pattern from her website. It's polka.chair.com, and you could also purchase it at your local quilt store, including ours. We used fabrics from Riley Blake's Christmas collection from this year, so I just wanted to give you a little tutorial that you would use in conjunction with buying this pattern, or you could use this method on your next paper piecing project. Get started with some of the tools that you are going to need. I always like to have an iron pad. This one has silicone on the back so it protects my table. A little iron pad and a little iron. That's going to save you a lot of time getting up from your sewing machine area. Also, I like to have a little mat. This one rotates, which is even better and faster for foundation paper piecing. This tool I cannot live without for foundation paper piecing. It's called the add a quarter ruler, and there's different sizes. You can get like a short one. Sometimes they're yellow. This one just happens to be pink. So the add a quarter ruler has a lip right here on the back side. So my fingernail is just running up against it. So this is 1/4 of an inch from this little lip here to the outside edge. So that's going to be your seam allowance, and how we're going to trim everything is with this add a quarter ruler. You can also trim it by using the other side and just trimming it like you would any acrylic ruler. So I kind of use it for both. You also are going to need your rotary cutter, whatever favorite one you like. I always like a 45mm rotary cutter. Of course, I'm going to be using this pattern here, which is from the Melissa Mortenson, and her website is polka.chair.com. I made this quilt without the joy blocks, but you can make the joy letters as well. So I'm just going to be demonstrating how the hat block is made today. So in her pattern, she's got all the written instructions, and they're really, really good for foundation piecing. Also, on the back, she has all the fabric requirements for the project as well. And there is also a way when you purchase the pattern to download the patterns, the paper patterns, or you can print them directly from here. So when I'm doing foundation paper piecing, I always use this vellum paper pieced paper, and I use my printer to print these out to save me a lot of time. So when I print these out on my printer, I always make sure that my settings are 100%, that it's not fit to page, so that I'm going to have an accurate, very, very accurate piece of pattern paper. So her patterns here, this is what they're going to look like for one Santa block. So on these patterns, they have all of the letters and numbers and even the cut piece sizes for all of the pieces that you're going to be cutting. So there's this particular one here, that's for the hat and the two sides. Then there's 2 on this page for the little ball on top of the hat, and then the bottom cuff of the hat. So this page here, I'm going to be cutting apart to separate these 2 sections. Alright, so now these 2 sections are separate, so I can just work with them independently. Also to note, on any kind of paper pieced pattern, you will have 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way around the outside of the block. And it's important that your fabric gets placed beyond this seam allowance all the way around. So we've got 1, 2, 3 sections. These will be paper pieced separately, and then they will be sewn together. So I'm going to start with this particular piece here, which has the largest sizes. So it'll be a good one to start with to get your feet wet. Okay, so let's start paper piecing. So you can see on my vellum paper, one of the reasons why I like to use this is that it's opaque and you can see your fabric through to the opposite side. So on the paper, I want to be sewing where I can see the letters, how they're written, so it's not upside down. So when you think about placing this, you're always going to think about placing it wrong sides together. I know you got to change your brain from what you've been doing. So wrong sides together. So I can see my letters here and the size of the piece of the fabric, and then on the back side, the right side is facing on my mat. Okay, so wrong sides together. Also, because it's see-through, and I can see through this vellum paper, I can clearly see that I have fabric beyond my seam allowance all the way around. So if I had my fabric something like this, let me get a little closer here. So if I had it like this, you can see that that fabric is not beyond that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. That's a no-no. It always has to be beyond. So you should be able to see that fabric extending beyond the lines of this piece and the 1/4 of inch seam allowance that's around the entire piece. All right, so another tool that I forgot to talk to you about in the beginning is flat head pins. I like these flower head ones. They're super sharp and they're perfect for paper piecing. Some people use glue. I don't mess with that. I just get my little flathead pin and I'm just gonna pin that. So that's step one. I've just got one piece of fabric and I've pinned that to this B1 spot. Okay. Now I'm gonna fold my paper between B1 and B2. Okay, so this fold, and I like to fold the paper first. So that's gonna give me a crease. Okay, and then I'll add a 1/4 ruler comes in. So I'm gonna actually use my rotating mat. Woohoo! Just turntable it around. So I have the lip of my ruler up against the lip of that paper. Okay, and then I'm going to trim my fabric. Check it. All right, so I got my 1/4 of inch seam allowance. I'm gonna kind of fold this over to the right side so you can see. Well, you can see it on this side too because I've got my vellum paper. So I've got my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. You can see that perfectly 1/4 of an inch away from that marked line. So to show you again, we've got our piece that our 1/4 of an inch has been trimmed. Okay, now I'm gonna flip this over, okay, because now I want to put my fabric B2 piece of fabric right sides together. And I'm gonna line it right up against the edge of that fabric that I cut. And I'm gonna get my other flower head pin and I'm gonna just pin a couple. I don't want that to shift on me. You can pin right through the paper. Okay, so now I have that pinned right sides together. Now I'm ready to sew this. So where I sew is from the paper side. And I'm gonna sew right on that line, the line between piece B1 and B2. And then after I'm done sewing, we'll come back and see what the next step is. Cool. So I sewed this and I used a pretty dark thread so you can kind of see it in this, but I would normally match my thread. So I'm gonna unpin that and take my pins off of this side too. The flathead pins make it lie flat underneath your sewing machine. It's awesome. So something I didn't talk about was kind of testing your fabric and making sure that it's gonna cover. So maybe what I should have done was laid my fabric down and then kind of fold it back to just test and make sure that's gonna cover all of those seam allowances. But I was good and you'll be good too. So now this is ready to press. So you can see that that covers completely that B2 section. And that's why having this little iron handy next to your machine and your cutting mat is so great for making lots of these blocks all the same way. All right, So that's pressed. And if we look at my opposite side, you can see that that extends completely. Let me get my little message. I don't like threads, so I'm gonna trim my little thread here. So you can see here that that piece extends underneath all along the seam allowance, and that's gonna be trimmed later on. Okay, so now let's focus on this other side. So I have another line that needs to be sewn here. That's the line between B1 and B3. So your steps are always gonna go in order, 1, 2, and then come over here to 3. All right, so we're gonna do this the same way we did before. We're gonna start by folding on the line. So I'm folding my paper on the line, okay? And then I'm going to use my add a quarter ruler right here, and I'm going to line up that lip, just slides right alongside that paper, and then I'm gonna trim the excess fabric. See? Check it out. Okay, so you can see my seam allowance. Now I'm going to flip that back over so it's flat, and then I'm going to bring my fabric so it's right side up, and I'm going to place my next piece 3 right sides together with my piece 1 that's been trimmed. And this is where, you know, on my first step I didn't really do that, but I'm going to show you here that a lot of times I like to audition and make sure that I've got that placed so that when it's sewn, it extends beyond my seam allowance. I'm going to take my pins out. I've already sewn that seam. You can see back here, I got my dark threads, sewn that, and I'm going to press it now. This little iron gets super hot. It's great for paper piecing. Okay, so now that I've sewn those 2, I'm ready to trim the rest of this block. So it's really important now when you're trimming, you won't trim on this inside line, always the outside. Always, always, always. You always need that 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around our block. And so you can use a regular rotary cutter, but I just flip my add a quarter ruler over, so I'm not using the lip. The lip is facing up now. And I just line that up with the very edge, right on that line. And, you know, it's always good when you're starting out to have plenty of fabric when you're paper piecing, because it just makes it a lot easier. But once you get used to it, you can use scraps, and you can just kind of fiddle with it and make sure that it's going to fit within that the outside edge of your block. I love a rotating mat. I love this one because it has these little finger spots, so I can just easily just find a spot and turn it really easily. Okay, so I've trimmed all the way around my piece, and I'm going to flip that over so you can see that's my section B completed. So now I'm ready to sew one of my other sections. This one is also really simple. This is my piece C. So this is the section C. Same method we did before. I'm going to start with my piece number 1. So my piece number 1 is a white piece. So this is like the brim of the Santa hat. Okay, and I'm going to put my fabric and my paper wrong sides together. So I'm going to flip that over to my wrong side. I'm going to make sure that extends 1/4 inch beyond the C1, and I'm going to just go ahead and place a flathead pin right in the center here. So you can see, you can kind of see through really well on my mat. So I'm going to lift that so you can see that C1 line, and then you can see that white fabric extending beyond that C1 line all the way around. Okay, so now I'm going to flip it over, or actually no, I'm going to start from this side, and I'm going to fold my fabric. So between C1 and C2, I'm going to fold my fabric on the line. I'm just concentrating on that one line because this has several different steps. Our first project was really simple. And I've got scraps here. I'm just gonna cut this piece in half because I know I don't need the whole big thing. All right, so I folded that over, and the next step is trimming the excess fabric. So I line up the lip of my add a quarter ruler along that paper, and I trim that. All right, so now I fold it back. See, I've got my 1/4 inch extending. I'm gonna bring it back so I can place my fabrics right sides together. And then I'm going to place a pin in it. And I keep my pin away from the line. Remember, because we're going to be sewing on that marked line. Okay, so now that's pinned, and I'm going to be stitching just this little short section here. So I don't go all the way this way where there's no line. Okay, I'm going to start right on the inner section, and so beyond my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Maybe doing a little back stitch in that area because that paper is going to be ripped out. So I like to do a little back stitch, especially on the outside where I'm not going to have another seam intersecting or sewing over it. So I'm going to stitch this and come back to you. Okay, I have stitched my line between C1 and C2, and you can see I extended a little bit beyond. That's okay. Beyond this line, so that's good. And then I did a little bit of back stitch here where I've got this little thread tail. Okay, so now I'm going to remove my pin, and I'm going to press that fabric with my little iron. It's so nice to have everything so close together. So you can see here on the back side that my seam allowance extends beyond this new section here, beyond my seam allowance around the outside. So now I'm ready to sew that step C3. So I fold it right on the line, place my ruler down, trim the excess fabric. So you really will become, like, it will become methodical for you. Place my fabric. Also, don't forget, you know, especially if you're starting out, just make sure that that folds back beyond. So then I'm going to pin that with one of my flathead pins. And then I will sew on that line between C1 and C3. Remove that. Press it. And everything's already trimmed underneath. Okay, so now I'm ready for my piece number C4. So it's a long piece that extends beyond all of this seam allowance here. So you're still going to fold that complete line right on the line, that C4 line. So if you've sewn past that line, you might have to release those stitches just a little bit. Kind of just pull them out. They're still attached to the fabric and everything. Okay. Now I've got my row. And this is where having the nice long add a quarter works out, because I can start here and then just slide it along. And this just trims all that up really nice. I try to kind of get a close to a 1/4 inch seam allowance already, but there was a little bit to trim. But if I had gone, you know, big, and it would still be good. All right, now I'm going to place my next fabric, which is also a long green piece, right sides together here. And then I'm going to put my pins in it. Do both of these. And then I'm going to stitch that last long row here. And that is going to go over those other pieces. And remember, that's going to extend beyond my seam allowance on the bottom. Okay, now I'm going to take out my pins. This is so exciting. Every time you get a piece done, get that last pin out, press this. Paper piecing is so great for just really accurate results, and you can do all kinds of shapes that you normally wouldn't be able to accomplish, or you could, but it would be much more tedious than this seems for those really cool paper pieced projects. I'm just trimming, remember, on the line, my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because now this piece is going to get sewn together with that first section. So I still have my hat piece here. This is piece B. Now I've got my piece C, and you can see how it's coming together and how accurate it is. So it all lines up just so. And now I'm going to place these right sides together. I still have my paper on. Yes, I do. I'm going to pin these. And you can use a 1/4 inch foot, or you already have the 1/4 inch line here. So you're going to stitch right sides together and sew those two pieces together now. So here it is. I've got my two pieces sewn together, and then you can press that through the paper and everything. So that is now the bottom of my little hat block. So now I've got to finish that last section, which is the ball on top. So that is section A. Now section A has probably the smallest, tiniest little pieces here. So, same thing, we're gonna do a lot of folding, and we're gonna get this last piece stitched together. So we're gonna start with A1. Remember, we're gonna start with our fabric pieces and our paper wrong sides together. So that's that nice big center square, and I'm just gonna stitch through, or pin through that center piece. Now I'm ready, I'm looking at these opposite side. So now I'm looking at my piece, my line between A1 and A2. And I'm gonna fold that back right on that line. Kind of like origami. Then I'm gonna line up my add a 1/4 ruler along the lip edge of that folded paper. So I'm never cutting through the paper until I'm done stitching all the way around the outside. So now I'm ready for my A2 piece, which is a little square. And I've got all kinds of scraps now from my pile, so I'm just gonna grab a little scrap. So when you're starting out, you can cut the pieces that they say to. I'm just gonna take a little scrap of fabric. See, it's irregular, it's not even a square. So when I lay that down, I can just peel it back and just make sure that that's gonna sew over all those pieces. So now I'm gonna go ahead and remove that pin because this is such a small piece. And I'm not moving the white fabric underneath, so don't worry. So now I'm ready to stitch that was folded. All right, so I stitched that little line there. Now I remove my pin, and I'm going to press that. All right, so now I'm ready to move on to my next number. So that's A3. I'll fold on that A3 line. Use my add a 1/4 ruler along the edge of the fabric. Fold my paper back. Bring my fabric, everything right side up, because I'm now going to place my next piece, my next little scrap, right sides together. I'm going to pin it. I probably should press that. All right, so that's now pinned, and now I'm going to be stitching that line between A3 and A1. So that, now I'm ready to press it. I really have a lot of fun with paper piecing. Okay, so now I'm ready to fold the next line, A4. So you can see I have 3 like scraps of fabric now. So kind of the scraps underneath sort of build. So now I'm going to line that up with the paper. So my lip is right along that fold. Cut my excess seam allowance. down. And now I'm ready to place that A4. As you, okay, I've got like all kinds of scraps of this. You know, they're big pieces that I have, but you don't really need that big pieces. But I'm gonna just use this giant piece here. So then I'm gonna lay that right sides together with that fabric I just trimmed. And you can always audition it and fold it over and make sure that it's gonna cover your seam allowance. Now I'm going to grab my pin, place it here in all those fabrics, and now I'm going to stitch on that number. All right, so that has been stitched, and then I'm going to press that also. Just making it into just a little ball on top of the hat. Okay, now I'm on A5. I'm gonna fold my paper back along that line, lay down my add a quarter ruler, trim that, fold my paper back, grab another scrap of fabric, it's pretty large, okay, and place that right sides together here. Twist my pin, come back. I'm just sewing that little, I'm not sewing that whole fold. I'm just sewing that little line. All right, I've just sewn that little bit here. Whew, those are all those little sections around that A piece. I always like to start with the hardest and then work my way. So then I've pressed that. Okay, so let's look here. The next number is A6. Okay, sometimes those little threads drive me insane. I gotta cut them. I can't handle it. Too many threads. All right, so now I'm going to fold that back. I'm gonna fold it right on the line. Even though I had a few stitches that went through, that's all right. I'm just gonna pull my paper back where it needs to be, line up the lip of that add a quarter ruler on the fold of the paper, and trim all this big stuff off. And I can use these big pieces for the next one. Fold that back. Now I'm gonna place A6, okay, which is a little bit bigger section. So when I place this one down, I wanna make sure that extends all the way past that seam allowance. I'm good. Kind of just scoot it here and try to save some fabric. Place my pin. And now I'm going to stitch along the A6, past that seam allowance here, and then on up. It's so fun when it starts coming together. So I stitched that. Okay, now I'm ready to press. And that just extends past all that seam allowance, all the way underneath. Now I'm ready for A7. Fold that on the line. Line up the lip of my add a quarter ruler. You can see sometimes it's alarming when you're trimming a lot of fabric. So it might be a good idea to, you know, use the size pieces they actually say. Okay, so now I'm ready to place A7, which is another one of these long guys here. Okay. So I'm going to lay my fabric here on that, and then place my pin in it, and then I'm going to stitch on the A7 line. So that's been sewn, and now I'm going to press. Ooh, I only have one piece left to sew, and that's my big long piece. First I've got to trim. Oh God, I'm getting so excited. So the next line I'm going to fold on is A8. No. Yes. Oh yeah, A8. Okay. I sewed beyond that a little bit. You know, it's like
there's fabric all along here already, so that's why I got kind of confused. Okay, so I'm gonna fold right on the line, the A8 line. Then I'm going to lay my add a quarter ruler down and trim all this excess fabric. Okay, now I'm ready to fold that back over. I gotta get this thread. Okay, and now I'm ready to place that long piece of fabric right sides together along here.
Thank you for watching my video on how to foundation paper piece. I hope that you found it informative. I hope that you're a little less scared to try paper piecing. And just remember, there's lots of different methods out there and lots of different tools. You can find everything you need at Completely Quilted.